join.
Thanks a lot for the intro, Freddie. So welcome to this session about clinical trials and research. In this session, we have two speakers. One of them is Professor Bryson. He's an assistant professor at MIT Biological Engineering. And we're having Kushal Gohil. He is a corporate strategy and innovation leader at Parexel. So welcome, Kushal and Brian.
Thank you for having us.
Maybe I can start with Brian. Let's move on to the research side of things. So in this session, we are trying to address what are the systemic issues, like systemic racism issues in research and clinical trial. And I would like to explore what aspects of these disparities we can address during a hackathon. Maybe I can start from your perspective, Brian, since you're working on tuberculosis, which is like an infectious disease affecting most of the world population, like COVID. So one of the things that, like, I'm a PhD student, and I know that most of the PhD students and researchers think that their research is objective and is not prone to racist biases or like these kind of discrimination. But throughout the history, we have seen that it's not the case. And one of the prototypical examples is like in the lab, most of the people are using Henrietta Lacks cell lines, which is taken without her consent. And if you go a little bit further back in the history, there has been some atrocious stuff done by like in gynecology research, for example. So what are the racial things that you see that are prevalent in research, especially in biology?
So that's a really important question. And I think there's many answers, so I won't give a complete one, but I'll tell you where we can start. So I think there's one example that I think we need to really be super cognizant of is in the era of genomics, who's being sequenced. I think that's a really important point in terms of thinking about when we think about genome-wide association studies, what do we call the human genome? Who is that based off of? Because I think those are clear examples where many of the original genomes that were sequenced were of people of Caucasian descent and really ignored Black and African populations. And I think that's something that we're trying to correct for now. But I think even just understanding the genome of people, what are the genomes that are being celebrated as the reference genome, for example? So that's just one example. I think another example that we oftentimes don't appreciate is just the sheer diversity of who is participating in either the scientific enterprise or the clinical trial enterprise. So for example, there's a really great campaign called All of Us right now, which is really focused on bringing in people of diverse backgrounds to clinical trials, because oftentimes we don't fully appreciate the sheer fact that people of different descents, different ethnicities, genders will all respond to particular therapeutics in different ways, and that's something that we don't fully appreciate. So those are just two examples that I'll start with, and I'm happy to give you more if you'd like.
Do you know why like these sequencing techniques are getting more and more interest, and they're getting a lot of traction? Many of the biomedical research is centered on like these sequencing techniques, and some of your papers are about like sequencing techniques. So where do you think that the problem is coming from? Like, who is sequencing these genomes, and what are the sources that we can actually address these like disparities? Like, are they done in a hospital setting, or are they like patients?
Yeah, so I think, it really comes down to a few things. It depends on how you want to, one, frame your question, and two, how you want to go about patient recruitment. So, currently in the NIH guidelines, there's a request that when you perform clinical trials or otherwise, that you should balance your population based off of sex, biological sex. Now, we don't have an equivalent set of guidelines for balancing our populations based off of ethnic background. So I think that is important because the conclusions that one could draw are very important. So I'll give you a real practical example. So, one of the ways that we think about designing vaccines that focus on cellular immunity, so this is not really focused on antibody-based vaccines, is thinking about what are called MHC, or major histocompatibility complex, which is really how, the infected immune cells ultimately present pathogen-derived product to the rest of the immune system. Now, what's really important is that in those MHC proteins, there's actually a lot of genetic diversity. In particular, you see that genetic diversity borne out, especially in highly geographic ways and highly clustered in terms of racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so many of the algorithms, in fact, work really well for predicting Caucasian HLA haplotypes, but do really poorly for predicting those of Black and Africans. And you can imagine in the disease that I study, which is tuberculosis, if you try to use those prediction tools and then to design a vaccine based off of that, that's not actually a really great strategy, because the populations that were used to train those databases are actually not the populations where the disease is endemic. So I think those are just really, again, examples of how we need to be really cognizant about how we train models, especially as we collect data and say, now we have a model that explains everything. No, you don't. You have a model that explains things for a very narrow band of the population.
I think immune system, as you suggested, is really like HLA is really person specific, and there can be some ethnic diversities in HLA or MHC proteins, as you suggested. And right now we're in the middle of a crisis, so an immune system is really important. Immunization is really important, as we discussed in the previous sessions. Do you think that these disparities are currently addressed? Like, for example, if vaccine companies are addressing these racial backgrounds adequately?
I think most people who are building vaccines and generating vaccines are really focused on humoral immunity, so antibodies. And I think there's less. I don't want to say that there is not a racial and ethnic component to how the antibody response in vaccination, but I think that's less well understood than the MHC response. So I think that they are, in terms of thinking about what the populations that they're testing their vaccines are. But I think we just saw recent examples not too long ago how, many of the COVID vaccines, we needed to challenge people to really think about what was the population that was being vaccinated in these early trials. And I think we've made corrections for that. But in 2020, it's kind of embarrassing if you don't know that that's important to begin with.
Maybe this is a good point to go back to clinical trials, because clinical trials are playing an important role in vaccine studies, or also in cancer trials and other drug trials. Maybe Kushal, you can try to enlighten me about how these different ethnicities are taken into account in these clinical trials.
So I'll maybe split my answer in two parts. Let me start with COVID. So Parexel right now is, engaged in 100 plus clinical engagements ranging from treatment, diagnostic, vaccine on the COVID front. And, we have had some good learnings out of this, because there's now this sudden sense of urgency across all stakeholders. So when you look at a, clinical trial timeline, everyone is thinking why is it taking so long for a vaccine to come to market? But if you compare the COVID-19 trials to the other trials that go on right now, the COVID trials are running at a light year speed, it takes much longer to get a drug to market. So I think overall the industry is trying to see how do we keep this same level of urgency on all the non-COVID trials as well. But I think when I talk about or think about ethnicity, And if you talk about clinical trials more in general, right, um, the overall aim of clinical trials, as many of you may know, is to either test efficacy, safety, or a combination of both. And like any scientific experiment, you don't like variability in your data, right? Like, so when the FDA reviews the data, they by default like a standard data set without a lot of outliers. And I think that in itself uh, does not align the incentive to go after diverse population, because that's going to, of course, change your streamlined data flow. The second factor is clinical trial recruitment most of the time happens through big hospital settings or through academic centers. So by default, you are only going after patients who already have access to some kind of healthcare. And you do miss out on all these diverse ethnic background patients. And this really got highlighted during COVID, right? Like when people have comorbidities, they are from these ethnic diverse backgrounds, and they are getting impacted more than the regular population. The clinical trials need to really think about the recruitment model. So I think one way to solve for this is through decentralized trial, where you really take the clinical trial to these patients. That can be in their home. We are partnering with the likes of CVS, using their Minute Clinic footprint to drive patients into clinical trial. But as you can imagine, you almost need to do a big reset in terms of how clinical trials work right now.
Maybe I can ask a question for both of you. Like, if you had a magic wand, and if you wanted to change something in your field to eradicate these racial biases, what would be the best way to go, and what would you change in the first place? And we can go with you, Brian.
I think importantly, I think it's important to just center the patient and understand what your patient population is and truly is, and who you want to serve. And I think that's the first thing that we need to do. If we can just focus on who is the patient, and the patient being a much more diverse population than we might come in with our preconceived notions, that would be really important. So I think, as somebody who works in a disease that does not necessarily impact many of the people here in the United States anymore, I'm deeply aware of this, but I think that a lot of people don't have that awareness. That the way that we think about even medicine and treatment is really different in different populations. So I think if we can actually just center the person, center the patient, I think that will do I think that will have the biggest impact, though I realize that that is the most difficult to do because it's amorphous. So I think the other solution is to come up with clear guidelines that must be met in order for a trial to continue to move forward.
Yeah, and I would add, like as Dr. Bryson said, technology will play a big role, but I think we have to start with the trust factor first. So I was at the DFARM conference earlier in the week, and there were members from Henrietta Lack's family at the DFARM conference. They kickstarted the conference, So I think the first step is to really go back and do all the wrongdoings that have happened, acknowledge that they did happen, and then really start with the education piece, like why clinical trial is important. Like, it's not just important socially, but if we don't recruit the right people when we are testing for drugs, both on efficacy and safety, we would have incomplete results if we keep on testing on one set of people and ignoring the wider population.
Maybe from a different perspective, like policy changes can also drive change. And actually, like FDA on the clinical trial side and NIH on the research side can play a huge role. Do you think that like they're playing that role right now?
I think so. The guidelines have been there for a few years, but I think now the industry is really moving towards a more, bias for action. So, for those of you who are following the news, BMS has dedicated $300 million war chest to increase diversity in clinical trials. And even when we are responding to these RFIs, RFPs for clinical trials, companies are really asking about key KPIs when it comes to diversity in recruitment. Overall, FDA, I think, is moving more from like a soft guideline stance to like really more of a mandatory requirement. But as I said, like the agencies alone won't be able to solve for this. We need like the entire ecosystem to completely align. And that's why I feel like platforms like these are so critical, because, you guys are trying to pull all the stakeholders to the same table to have this discussion.
Thanks, Kushal. Do you have anything to add, Brian?
I think I 100% agree with Kushal. I think the system needs to change, and while we can push from the top to kind of have these trickle down guidelines, it also depends on what's the incentive. I think what is the incentive for pharma companies to really rapidly modify how they assemble their clinical trials and enroll people. So I think I hate the fact that we have to ask what the incentive is other than just being just, but that's just a practical reality, is that some of these companies, the best way to get them is to either provide a penalty for not doing so, or they get some incentive for doing the right thing, which like, I don't know why that has to happen, but that's just capitalism.
I think for the sake of time, we need to conclude this panel. Thanks a lot for joining us, Brian and Kushal. And if you have any other comments, we can have it right now, or otherwise I will hand the panel to Angel.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Have a nice day.